Hello, my name is Perry Wolf, and this is a code review of my fitness tracker application for the CS 499 Computer Science Capstone course. This application is designed to let a user track their fitness information. So first they can create an account, either online or offline. When they type in their username and password, they'll be taken to their profile page right here where they can fill out all this information. If it's already filled out from a previous login, then it will be displayed and their username at the top. They can track their weight, exercise, and diet. These are all their weights. This is where they can input a diet for the day. These items in this list will be clickable, or they are clickable if the user has made any entries, and they can go into that day and see what foods they've eaten. And then the exercise page where they can input an exercise. Recommendations will be given based on the data gathered. There's an algorithm to tell the user if they're exercising enough, eating too much or too little to meet their weight goals. Eventually there will be a graph on this page so they can track their weight over a longer period of time. And that is pretty much what the application does. For local users, the SQLite database is used. This is the database helper class to communicate with the SQLite database. For online users, whenever data is entered or retrieved, it uses the Microsoft SQL Server database to relay the data back and forth. Okay, so for the code review, start with structure. Does the code completely and correctly implement the design? A lot of the functionality works. There are some things that do not work, which will be taken out. They were for a previous enhancement from when I took this course before that I did not complete. Does the code conform to any pertinent coding standards? So for the most part, I try to make sure my indentation is correct within each method, with a comment above each method to tell what is happening, as well as for each code block, so all the variables have a comment. Let me go to an activity. Here's the user profile activity. This has a lot going on. As you can see, there are 400 lines of code. So I try to make sure everything's indented correctly, and the spacing as well. Is the code well structured, consistent in style, and consistently formatted? There's some things that I have learned recently that I will try to implement if I have time. For example, I think some classes should implement interfaces depending on whether the user is logged in remotely or locally. Will probably make a lot of things easier. Are there any uncalled for or unneeded procedures or any unreachable code? Not that I'm aware of, though some of the things that don't work properly, like this algorithm, needs some work for sure. If I have time, I'll fix it, but if not, I am mainly trying to complete the enhancements that I have chosen for the for this class. So I'll probably branch my version control before I start the enhancements and get rid of a lot of stuff that I'm not satisfied with. Are there any leftover stubs or test routines in the code? No, I don't have any test routines in the code at the moment. Can any code be replaced by calls to external reusable components or library functions? There are some external libraries that I use. A lot of them are in the database helper class. So I use that extensively in this. Use this Android.database package. As much as I can, I try to use the external libraries when I know they can be used. But I'm sure there are some parts that maybe could make an external call to complete the thing that I probably put too much time into working on. Are there any blocks of repeated code that could be condensed into a single procedure? This algorithm to give the user recommendations, I can probably condense all of that into a single class. It's right now each activity that has a recommendation. Let's see. Yeah, has its own code, but it could probably be simplified and put together. So if I have time, I'll try to do that. Is storage use efficient? That's one of the things that I'm gonna hopefully be fixing with my enhancement. So right now, from the database helper and as well as the SQL Server database, when data is retrieved, it's stored in an array list, and if a specific piece of data needed to be searched, eventually it would have to iterate through the entire list until it reached that date. So a better way would be to use a binary search to find the data so that you're minimizing the number of uh, checks before the data is found. Are symbolics used rather than magic number constants or string constants? So yes, an example of that is right here in this recommendation. So it's checking to see if this number is greater than 200 or less than 200, but it'd be better to define these numbers somewhere else, as well as here and here. All of these should be defined somewhere else so that it's really easy to read. All these numbers could be stored in one place, and then if I wanted to change the check, if I wanted this to be 2.5, then I could change it where the variable is declared instead of here. So all of these 300s might even be one variable, and that would keep me from having to change each one. So there are probably some other places in my code that's an issue, and I'll be hopefully finding them and changing that going forward. Are any modules excessively complex and should be restructured or split into multiple routines? Yes. So this there's a method. This method is very complicated. I should definitely look at restructuring that, as well as here there's some very complex methods. So there's like double and triple, like loops within loops in some of these methods. This one, for example, is very complicated and should probably be restructured. Documentation. Is the code clearly and adequately documented with an easy to maintain commenting style? I think so. Some of these methods, every method at least has a comment explaining what it does, but I should probably put put comments within the method to explain what each block is doing. Would make it a lot easier to understand. But at least each method has a comment. Are all comments consistent with the code? Yes. So the comment does at least give a general overview of what the code below it does. Variables. Are all variables properly defined with meaningful, consistent, and clear names? Yes. Do all assigned variables have proper type consistency or casting? Yes. So there's a lot of instances of strings needing to be parsed. They will need checks to ensure that the user has entered a number instead of a letter for some of these, but they do use the parseInt method to convert it from string to integer or double in some cases. Arithmetic operations. Does the code avoid comparing floating point numbers for equality? Yes, there's only one place that the user should enter a floating point number, and that is when tracking their weight. So there's no direct equals sign. It's always either less than or greater than to avoid unwanted results. Does the code systematically prevent rounding errors? There should not be any rounding errors. In the code, the only place would be where the user is able to input a double. Does the code avoid additions and subtractions on numbers with greatly different magnitudes? Yes. There are not many very large numbers. So this should not be an issue anywhere in the code. Are divisors tested for zero or noise? Yes, I believe there are lots of places in this database helper where if, for example, the cursor is empty, then the method exits and nothing happens. Loops and branches. Are all loops, branches, and logic constructs complete, correct, and properly nested? Some of these in the database helper, this one for example, is super complicated. I think in a lot of these cases, I was just trying to get the result to be right, but a lot of these probably need to be restructured. Are the most common cases tested first in if-else chains? So in the login activity, which is right here, the first, when the user clicks the login button, it first checks to see if either of the fields, the username or password fields, are empty, and gives the user this toast message. Then it checks to see if the username exists, and then it checks to see if the password matches the user's password in the database. And if all of that works, then the user's logged in. So this is one case where I might need to flip this around, but this makes more sense to me. It should usually, well, I probably need to change this because usually the user will type in their correct username and password, and then the other things should be tested if that is not right. That will reduce the amount of code, the amount of checks necessary for the user to log in. Does every case statement have a default? There are no switch statements used, so yes. Are loop termination conditions obvious and invariably achievable? Um, yes, so there are lots of loops in this class. Most of them are when the cursor gets to a certain size or reaches the end of the data, then it exits. So all of those loop termination conditions are explicitly defined. Are indexes and subscripts properly initialized just prior to the loop? Yes, there are lots of examples of that throughout this class. Can any statements that are enclosed within loops be placed outside the loops? I don't believe so. There's a lot of code in this class to look through. This is where 95% of the loops are. But everything happening in the loop needs to be in the loop. Can any statements that are... Does the code in the loop avoid manipulating the index variable or using it upon exit from the loop? Yes, so the loop variables are only iterated once the function of the loop has been completed. So in this case, it's going to get the data from the cursor and then it's going to move to the next. Defensive programming. Are indexes, pointers, and subscripts tested against array, record, or file bounds? So the indexes have checks to make sure they're so if data is being accessed within the bounds of the array list of data. I do not use pointers or subscripts. Are imported data and input arguments tested for validity and completeness? No. So all of these user input checks, or they should be checked to make sure the user's typing the right character or whether it's a integer or character. So tests should be used there. Are all output variables assigned? So there's a variable for when the user selects one of these widgets, that will be assigned to a variable. So as far as I'm aware, yes. So all the output has a variable assigned to it. Are the correct data operated on in each statement? Yes. So I don't believe there is any code that is operating on something other than what it should be. Is every memory allocation deallocated? So the main allocation of memory is when a data set is added to an array list to generate the data for the user. When the user changes activities, that array list should be deallocated. There are also cursors in here to move through the database, so there are lots of these statements. Cursor.close, so that will close the cursor once the array list is generated. Are timeouts or error traps used for external device accesses? No, there aren't any external device accesses, except for the SQL Server database. So this is the method used to connect to the SQL Server, the Microsoft SQL Server database. I might need to add some functionality to timeout if the user is inactive for too long. But I only know the basics of SQL Server, so there might be something already in that. I'll have to look into that. Definitely a potential security problem. Are all files and devices left in the correct state upon program termination? Yes. So when the user closes the program, everything, nothing needs to be saved because everything should have already been saved or changed on the database. So that should not be an issue. For the enhancements for this project, my plan is to add storage for a wellness journal for the user. So this might add some challenge to the database data types because the journal entries need to be able to store a large number of characters. So I'll have to create both locally and remotely for the SQLite and the Microsoft SQL Server databases fields to store that data, and then a means of entering it within the user interface. That's for the software engineering update. For my second enhancement in the data structures and algorithms category, I'll be implementing a binary search. So currently the data that is received from the remote or local database is stored in an array list, um, which is fine unless the user wants to search for a specific date. The array list will have to be searched through one at a time from the start. So if the user was searching for the most recent entry, the entire list will have to be checked before it finds the one the user is looking for. With a binary search, it will reduce the amount of time needed to sort through all the data. For the third enhancement in the databases category, I plan on setting up the SQL Server database to allow guest users, because currently the user is actually when they create an account, they're given an account for the remote database server as well, in which they really don't need access to. They don't need to be able to log into the data server. So by using guest accounts, Microsoft SQL Server allows the user to access the data without being logged into the server with actual credentials. So this will be a lot more secure than a remote user having actual access to go into the data server and make queries. And that's it for my code review and enhancement plan. Thank you for listening.